and proceeding with the lesson. Support the channel by subscribing if you find the summaries interesting. So let's get started. The film begins with an introduction of Mason, who works as a lawyer. He then sees an old photo taken when he served in the U.S. Special Forces. Before becoming a part-time lawyer, he was a highly trained Special Forces soldier. Mason had a strong since childhood and always protected his weak friends, which eventually led him to receive military training in the U.S. and later to be selected for a Special Forces team. One day, Mason was given a mission to destroy the president of Polonia, an African country populated mainly by Latin Americans. This president was known for his brutality towards his own people. As Mason was heading to Polonia, the helicopter carrying him and his team was attacked by the Polonia president's army. It was a horrific incident, and some of Mason's colleagues were killed. Fortunately, Mason survived and returned home, but the ordeal left him so traumatized that he decided to leave the military. Since then, he has worked part-time as a lawyer. After a moment of reflection on his past, Mason quickly leaves to take his daughter to school. Along the way, his daughter tells him that one of her friends is bullying her. Mason encourages her to stand up for herself, even jokingly telling her that using a blunt object can make her think again. After dropping his daughter off, Mason heads to his office, where he receives a surprise visit from former General Sebastian. Sebastian explains that Mason wants to accompany an American journalist on a mission. Mason initially refuses, as he is no longer interested in weapons or combat, but Sebastian tempts him with a generous salary, mentioning that the mission will take place in Polonia. He emphasizes that Mason's only assignment is to accompany journalist Clara, who will interview the ruthless president of Polonia. Sebastian chooses Mason for this mission because of his previous experience in Polonia, but it doesn't go so well. Mason asks for some time to think about it and promises to tell Sebastian his decision the next day. A while later, Mason went to pick up his daughter from school, and when he got there, he was surprised to see his wife, Rebecca. The school had called her because her daughter had hit a classmate who had been bullying her with a rock, and the injured child had to go to the hospital. Their daughter admitted that she did it because her father, Mason, suggested it. This really upset Rebecca because Mason had taught her daughter something wrong. Plus, her daughter had to pay the hospital bills for the injured child in the school. Unfortunately, Rebecca doesn't know how to find all this money since Mason hasn't paid her for months since he started working part-time. Feeling guilty about the situation, Mason asks Rebecca if she would accept Sebastian's mission. He explains that he will pay him a significant amount of money to cover all losses on the mission. At first, Rebecca is worried about Mason going on a mission and is worried that he will not return, but she also realizes that her family is in dire financial straits and that she does not have many options. So she finally allows Mason to go. After a while, Mason contacts Sebastian and tells him that he is ready to do the mission right away. Sebastian then asks Mason to meet a reporter who will accompany him to his office. Mason meets a reporter named Clara. He wastes no time in informing her that Sebastian has sent him to accompany him to an interview with President George Venus in Polonia. So Mason and Clara go to Polonia to meet President Venus, but Mason is very cautious and keeps his distance from Venus, fearing that she will trap them both. After a warm welcome, Venus takes Mason and Clara to the palace for an interview. However, they are suddenly attacked by a mysterious force along the way. Mason wastes no time in counterattacking and eventually eliminates all the attackers. At first, Mason suspects Venus may be behind the attack, but Venus swears that these are not his people and that they are after him too. Venus explains that she has been facing sudden attacks from an unknown force for the past several months. The reason he wanted to interview Clara was to draw international media attention to the issue. Nevertheless, Mason still does not trust Venus and decides to leave with Clara. On the way, Mason contacts Sebastian and asks him to send a rescue helicopter. He tells Sebastian about the attack he just experienced from an unknown force. Upon hearing this, Sebastian asks Mason to send him his current location, and Mason promises to send a rescue helicopter within 20 minutes. 20 minutes later, Mason and Clara spot an approaching helicopter, but it is not the helicopter sent by Sebastian, but the enemy helicopter that is still chasing them. Realizing the danger, Mason grabs Clara and escapes, and they engage in a chase and shootout in the forest. Mason tries to shoot down the pursuing helicopter whenever he has the chance, and succeeds. After destroying the helicopter, the remaining 2 enemy soldiers drive them out. At first, they thought there was no escape, but Venus appeared and killed the attackers. This made Mason realize that the army was not subservient to Venus, and he and Clara decided to team up with him. Venus later invited Mason and Clara to rest in a nearby town, which turned out to be his hometown. Meanwhile, there was a mercenary named Mike who received a call from a mysterious man. The mysterious man asks Mike to find Venus, Mason, and Clara. Venus, Mason, and Clara arrive at Venus' hometown and are warmly welcomed by all the townspeople. Even the village chief, who has been friends with Venus since childhood, thanks her. Afterwards, they decide to freshen up since they haven't had a chance to shower since. Later, Clara uses Mason's phone to prepare an interview with Venus, and all the townspeople gather to watch. In the interview, Clara asks Venus why she has a reputation for being cruel to people. Venus explains that this is all a lie and slander, because he is not like that at all. He points out that the townspeople love him, as evidenced by their support. Venus mentions that the country has a valuable resource called Lannis, which is coveted by the major world powers. This is one of the reasons why he is constantly accused of being a harsh ruler, because these powers wanted to overthrow the Polonian government in order to gain access to the Lannis data. However, Venus is determined to prevent this from happening and promises to protect her homeland at all costs. Hearing this, the townspeople cheer in support, and even Mason begins to completely trust Venus. After the interview that night, they all decide to stay in the town. Clara and Mason happen to be in the same room, and she proposes to him because of his muscular physique. However, Mason refuses her advances, thinking of his family waiting for him at home. The next day, Mason asks Venus who is behind the constant attacks on him. Venus suggests that Mason ask who originally sent him on this mission. Mason immediately contacts Sebastian, as Sebastian had assigned him to accompany Clara. When talking to Sebastian, he explains that he intentionally chose Mason to protect Clara, as he knew there would be a lot of attacks. If he had chosen a different guard, Clara might not have made it this far. Mason then asks who the military is behind the attack. Sebastian then explains that the attack was organized by the African Union, a major world power. They wanted to overthrow the government of Polonia by eliminating Venus. The African Union also worked with Venus' nephew and vice president, Jorge Mendes, to oust Venus from power. Upon hearing this, Mason finally realizes that Venus is innocent, and now Venus decides to protect him too. Soon after, a mercenary group, led by Mike, suddenly appears in the village. Mike has been hired by the African Union to track down Venus. He immediately takes the village chief hostage and forces him to reveal where Venus is hiding. Venus, not wanting the village chief to be hurt, surrenders on the condition that all the villagers are safe. However, just as Mike is about to take Venus away, Mason and Clara arrive on horseback and rescue Venus. The chase continues, Clara is captured, and Mason and Venus continue to run to escape Mike. As they head deeper into the forest, Venus begins to tell Mason a story of events that happened in the past. It was about a U.S. Special Forces helicopter that was shot down by African Union mercenaries in this very forest. Upon hearing this, Mason realizes that the U.S. Special Forces Venus was referring to were actually his own unit. He now realizes that the attackers were not Venusians, but African Union mercenaries. Mason feels guilty and can't find the words to express his regret for mistaking Venus for a villain. Venus suggests that Mason trade Clara for Mason, since he has nothing to do with the conflict in his country. Venus takes Mason to her friend Smith's house. When they get there, Venus asks Smith to help arrange a trade between him and Clara, who is still being held hostage by Mike and his group. Smith agreed to help Venus without hesitation. The next day, they found Mike holding Clara hostage while waiting for Venus. To their surprise, Smith led a protest by the townspeople right in front of Mike's troops, causing a commotion and diverting their attention. In the midst of all this chaos, Venus planned to rescue Clara and take her to the presidential palace. Before leaving, he planned to invite Mason to broadcast the real story live from the Blue House to the world. Meanwhile, Mendes, Venus' nephew, was wandering around the presidential palace, thinking that Venus had already been killed. Suddenly, Venus arrived with Clara and Mason. At the same time, a traitorous commander of the Polonian army appeared and tried to attack Venus, which led to a shootout. Eventually, Venus killed the commander and Mendes was mortally wounded. Venus. The soldiers believed that Venus had killed Mendes and the commander. Venus explained everything that had happened, and his words were supported by a video recorded on Clara's cell phone. This convinced the soldiers that he was telling the truth. Minutes later, Mike and his mercenaries made a surprise attack on the presidential palace, which sparked a fierce battle between the African Union mercenaries and the Polonia army. As the fight progressed, Mason found himself in a difficult position with Mike. Fortunately, Clara got help from Mason's, which were broadcast live on Clara's cell phone. After a while, Mason and the army of Polonia, with the help of Sebastian's army. A few days later, the truth about President Polonia Beneš was broadcast on international television channels. Now the world realized that President Beneš of Polonia was a good man who was falsely accused by greedy people who wanted to exploit the country's natural resources. On the other hand, Rebecca, who saw her husband's exploits on TV, was incredibly proud of Mason, the part-time lawyer who saved the entire country. The next day, Mason finally came home and Rebecca hugged him tightly. He also received surprising news from Sebastian. He sent Mason $5 million in missionary money. Rebecca was happy to hear this because she no longer had to worry about money. The moral of the story is this: be careful what you advise your children, or you risk saving the entire country just to pay the hospital bills.